3 days after I buried the woman who had helped me build a $15 million company, my daughter-in-law walked into my house, dropped a stack of papers on my kitchen table, and demanded that I sign control of the business over to my 18-year-old grandson. She said I was too old, too grief-stricken, and no longer clear-headed enough to keep running the company. But what hurt me more than anything she said was the fact that my own son sat right beside her, listening to every word that came out of his wife's mouth without objecting once. I could have lost my temper right then. I could have thrown both of them out of my house. But then I saw something they didn't know I had seen in the reflection of the kitchen window. I caught Monica typing a message on her phone. The old man took the bait. In that moment, I understood that this was no longer a disagreement about the future of the company. They were trying to get me to sign something they believed I was too devastated to read carefully. And they had badly underestimated me. My name is Richard Caldwell. I was 70 years old, and I was the founder of Caldwell Logistics, a transportation company worth roughly $15 million. But back in 1985, Diane and I had nothing except a rusted-out truck and exactly $100 in our bank account. I drove while Diane sat beside me with a notebook balanced on her knees, recording every gallon of fuel, every unpaid customer invoice, and every bill we had no idea how we were going to cover. There were days when I drove 14 hours straight while she stayed awake late into the night calling customers, preparing invoices, and negotiating for a few extra days to pay what we owed. We slept in the truck because we couldn't afford a motel. More than once, we had to choose between replacing a worn tire and paying the electric bill. Nearly 40 years later, that rusted truck had become a company with hundreds of employees and contracts stretching across several states. People often told me that I had built Caldwell Logistics. I always corrected them. Diane and I built it. Without her, the company probably would have died in its first year. So when cancer took Diane from me, I didn't just lose my wife. I lost the person who had stood beside me from the beginning, the only person who truly understood what we had sacrificed to build everything we had. 3 days after the funeral, the house still smelled of sympathy flowers. I sat alone in the kitchen with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, occasionally catching myself staring at the chair where Diane had sat every morning. Her blue mug was still on the shelf. I hadn't found the courage to put it away. At around 10 that morning, the doorbell rang. Monica stood on the porch, wearing a cream-colored designer suit. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless. 3 days earlier, she had stood beside Diane's coffin dressed in black. That morning, she brought no flowers, no food. She didn't ask whether I had slept. The only thing she brought was a leather briefcase. "Richard, we need to talk about the company." Monica walked inside, went straight to the kitchen, and placed her briefcase on the exact spot where Diane used to sit. Then she pulled out a thick stack of documents. Across the first page were the words, "Emergency Transition Agreement." I asked what could possibly be so urgent that it needed to be handled 3 days after Diane's funeral. Monica told me Diane's death had placed me under tremendous emotional strain. At 70, she said, I needed time to rest and recover, while Caldwell Logistics needed a transition plan to prevent the company from falling into chaos. I let her finish. Then I asked who she intended to put in charge. Chase. Chase was my 18-year-old grandson. At least, that was what I still believed at the time. I loved the kid, but Chase was more interested in motorcycles, parties, and expensive toys than anything related to business. He had never worked a full week at Caldwell Logistics. A few months earlier, he had actually asked me what the difference was between revenue and profit. And Monica wanted to place a $15 million company in his hands. I told her Chase wasn't ready. Monica immediately replied that nobody was ever ready until someone gave them a chance. When I pointed out that Chase hadn't even completed his first year of college, she dismissed it and said a degree didn't determine whether someone could lead. I asked why any of this had to happen immediately after Diane's death. For the first time, irritation appeared on Monica's face. Richard, I understand that you're grieving, but the company can't stop functioning just because our personal lives have suffered a tragedy. I stared at her for a long moment. Deanne had been buried 3 days earlier, and the woman sitting in her chair had just reduced her death to a problem in our personal lives. I didn't argue. Instead, I lowered my eyes and began reading the agreement. Monica had prepared it carefully. If I signed, my voting authority would be transferred. My ability to appoint executives would be transferred. My access to company accounts would be transferred. My authority to approve contracts would be transferred. Then I reached an indemnification clause near the end of the document. If I signed, I wouldn't merely be surrendering control. I would also be acknowledging responsibility for a series of financial activities that had occurred before the transition. I had spent nearly 40 years in business. I knew exactly what I was looking at. A trap. That was when Derek walked in. My son was 46 years old at the time, and for most of my life I had believed that one day he would take over Caldwell Logistics. But the man who entered my kitchen that morning didn't look like a son coming to check on a father who had just buried his wife. He looked like someone who had been called in to help close a deal. Derek sat beside Monica and told me his wife was only trying to help. When I asked whether he had actually read the agreement, Derek looked at Monica before answering. When I asked whether he honestly believed Chase should be running the company, he avoided giving me a direct answer. Instead, he said I needed rest and that the family had to prepare for the future. I was beginning to see something I had spent years refusing to admit. Derek wasn't controlling this conversation. Monica was. I could have rejected the agreement immediately. But nearly 40 years in business had taught me something important. When someone believes you haven't noticed the trap, sometimes the smartest thing you can do is let them keep believing it. I leaned back in my chair. I deliberately let my shoulders sag. Then I told them I needed time to think. The tension disappeared from Monica's face almost instantly. She left the documents on the table and told me she wanted an answer before the end of the week. I stood and walked toward the sink. The kitchen window in front of me reflected the room behind me, and in that reflection, I saw Monica pull out her phone. She typed a message. The old man took the bait. I stood motionless in front of the sink. This was no longer simple ambition. Monica knew exactly what she was doing. And that message made me suspect she wasn't doing it alone. After they left, I returned to the table and started reading the agreement again from the beginning. This time, I wasn't reading it as a grieving husband. I wasn't reading it as a father desperately trying to trust his son. I was reading it as the man who had built Caldwell Logistics from a rusted truck and $100. I didn't know what they had done yet, but I was going to find out. The next mornings, I arrived at Caldwell Logistics before 7. The parking lot was nearly empty, and for the first few minutes, everything seemed normal. The gray brick building, the Caldwell Logistics sign, the trucks lined up behind the warehouse. All of it was exactly what I had seen thousands of times before. Then I reached the internal record storage area and held my master key card against the scanner. A dry beep sounded "Dex denied." I tried again. The light stayed red. For nearly 40 years, there had never been a door inside Caldwell Logistics that I couldn't open. I was the founder, the controlling shareholder, and I hadn't signed a single transition document. And yet, someone had disabled my access to my own company. I stood there for several seconds, not because I was confused, but because I wanted to understand what kind of reaction they were hoping to provoke. I could have pounded on the door. I could have called security. I could have demanded that someone from IT come down immediately and restore my access. But if Monica and Derek were preparing to portray me as mentally unstable after Diane's death, an angry 70-year-old man causing a scene in the hallway would be exactly what they needed. Before I could leave, Bradley Jenkins appeared. Bradley was the CFSO of Caldwell Logistics, and he had worked for the company long enough that I had once considered him almost part of the family. He was in his 50s, always impeccably dressed, soft-spoken, and the kind of man who never seemed to let emotion interfere with numbers. That morning, his smile appeared a little too quickly. "Richard, I didn't know you were coming in. I didn't know my key card had stopped working." Bradley glanced at the scanner and explained that Derek had requested a security upgrade while I was away dealing with the funeral. He said, "My access might have been temporarily placed on a list requiring reauthorization." "You should go home and rest for a few days," Bradley said. "Nobody expected you back this soon." I looked at him. In less than 2 days, I had heard the same message from 3 different people. Monica wanted me to rest. Derek wanted me to rest. Now Bradley wanted me to rest. It was beginning to sound less like concern and more like an instruction. I simply nodded, told him maybe he was right, and walked back toward my office. Bradley didn't follow me. He clearly believed the conversation was over. But I didn't leave the building. 10 years earlier, when Caldwell Logistics moved most of its financial systems onto digital platforms, I had insisted that our technology team create an emergency backup layer. I never trusted a system with only one key. Technology changes, employees change, passwords get locked. But the owner of a company should never allow the entire history of his business to depend on a button someone else can control. After years of upgrades, that backup route no longer appeared in our standard operating documents, but I still had an encrypted external drive hidden inside my desk. I locked my office door, opened the bottom drawer, and removed the thin wooden panel inside. The drive was still exactly where I had left it. I connected it to an offline computer. A database appeared on the screen that most current employees didn't even know existed. I didn't need direct access to the live company network. I only needed synchronization histories, authentication logs, and transaction copies that had been archived periodically. If someone was trying to erase their tracks, they could alter what appeared on the main system. But history is harder to erase than people think. I had barely started reviewing the access logs when my phone rang. The call came from the county hospital. A nurse asked whether I was Richard Caldwell, grandfather of Chase Caldwell. My entire body went rigid before she even finished the sentence. Chase had been in a motorcycle accident. His condition was serious. He was being prepared for surgery. Every suspicion I had about Monica, Derek, and Caldwell Logistics vanished from my mind. I shut down the computer, hid the drive, and left the company so quickly, I nearly forgot to lock my office. When I reached the hospital, Derek was standing outside the emergency department, with a face as white as paper. He paced back and forth, his hands visibly shaking. Monica stood near a window with her phone pressed to her ear. Speaking to someone while repeatedly glancing down the hallway, I asked about Chase. Derek told me an SUV had struck his motorcycle at an intersection. He had lost a lot of blood, broken several bones, and the doctors were trying to control internal bleeding. Monica ended her call and walked over. She said Chase never should have been riding that motorcycle in the first place, and immediately began blaming Derek for allowing him to buy it. I didn't want to hear anyone assigning blame. I only asked whether Chase was conscious. Monica said no. Then, almost immediately afterward, she turned to Derek and asked whether the company transition meeting, scheduled for the end of the week, would have to be postponed. I stared at her. Her son was lying behind the doors of an operating room, and part of Monica's mind was still at Caldwell Logistics. Before I could say anything, a doctor came out. He explained that Chase had lost a significant amount of blood and needed additional transfusions. Chase was AB positive. The hospital's compatible supply was running low because they had treated victims from a major accident the previous night. The doctor asked about the blood types of Chase's parents and close relatives. Monica said she was type A. Derek was type O. I knew I was type O. Deanne had been type O as well. As I listened, something inside my head stopped. I wasn't a doctor, but I knew enough basic genetics to understand that something didn't add up. Derek was type O. Monica was type A. Chase was AB. Where had the B come from? I looked at the doctor. but he was focused on finding blood, not investigating paternity. Then I looked at Derek. If a father had just heard information, suggesting that his son's blood type was genetically impossible, the natural reaction should have been confusion, questions, disbelief, maybe an insistence that the hospital had made a mistake. Derek did none of those things. His face went pale. Sweat appeared on his forehead. He looked down at the floor and clenched his hands. And suddenly, I realized something that chilled me more than the blood type discrepancy itself. Derek didn't look like a man discovering a secret. He looked like a man terrified that a secret he had known for years was finally coming out. Chase remained in surgery for nearly 3 hours. During that entire time, I sat across from Derek and Monica in the waiting room without mentioning the blood type once. Monica repeatedly stood up, sat back down, and checked her phone. Derek leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. Every time I looked at him, he avoided my eyes. I no longer knew whether I was watching a father terrified of losing his son or a man terrified that an old lie was about to be exposed. After almost an hour, I stood and told Derek to come downstairs to the hospital cafeteria with me. Monica started to follow. I told her I wanted to speak to my son alone. We chose a table in the farthest corner. The cafeteria was almost empty. The only sounds were the coffee machine and the wheels of hospital carts passing in the corridor outside. I didn't waste time. "Why is Chase AB?" Derek stared at me for several seconds before asking what I was talking about. I repeated the blood types. He was O, Monica was A, Chase was AB. I asked whether the hospital had ever told him that before. Derek immediately became defensive. He said the medical records could be wrong. The hospital could have entered the wrong blood type. Maybe I was reading too much into a piece of medical information I didn't fully understand. I told him that if that was true, all we had to do was ask the doctor. His reaction was stronger than I expected. He told me to stop. Chase was lying on an operating table, and I was turning the situation into an interrogation. I asked why he was getting angry if it was nothing more than a clerical error. Derek half rose from his chair before sitting back down. Then he told me I had just lost Diane, that I hadn't slept properly in days. That grief was making me suspicious of everyone around me. That sentence clarified something else. Monica had told me I wasn't thinking clearly. Bradley had told me I needed to rest. Now Derek was using my grief to dismiss a perfectly reasonable question. I didn't argue. I simply looked at my son and said, "All right, maybe I'm wrong." His shoulders relaxed immediately. It was the reaction of a man who believed he had just escaped danger, and that told me I wasn't wrong. 2 days later, Chase was out of immediate danger. The doctors said he would need weeks to recover, but his life was no longer at risk. I brought soup and groceries to Derek's house. Monica looked slightly surprised to see me, probably because she assumed our conversation at the hospital had created distance between us. I behaved as though nothing had happened. I asked Chase how he was feeling, helped adjust the pillow beneath his injured leg, and made a few comments about the motorcycle. I even told him that once he recovered, the two of us were going to have a serious conversation about whether he should ever ride one again. Chase gave me a weak smile. That made what I was about to do even harder. I had held that boy when he was an infant. Diane had stayed awake all night, caring for him whenever Derek and Monica traveled. Every Christmas, the stocking with Chase's name on it had hung in the center of our fireplace. If DNA told me something different, 18 years of memories wouldn't simply disappear. But I needed the truth. When Monica went downstairs to answer a phone call and Derek left to pick up medication, I walked into the guest bathroom. Chase's electric toothbrush was sitting in a cup beside the sink. I removed the used brush head, placed it in a sample bag, and replaced it with an identical new one I had purchased earlier. Then I passed through the laundry room. Derek's gym jacket was lying on a chair. I found 2 hairs caught near the collar. Both still had follicles attached. I placed them in a separate envelope. Wasn't proud of secretly collecting DNA from my son and the boy I had raised as my grandson, But when the truth inside my own family was being used as a weapon against me, I needed evidence. At 2 in the morning, I drove across the city to a private laboratory. I paid $5,000 in cash for expedited results within 48 hours. The technician asked whether I wanted to reconsider. "Tests like this," he said, "sometimes destroyed families." I looked at him. "My family may already be destroyed. I just don't know it yet." On the drive home, I couldn't stop thinking about Derek. Part of me still wanted to believe Monica had deceived him. If Chase wasn't biologically his, maybe Derek had only discovered the truth recently and was still trying to live with the shock. But his reaction at the hospital hadn't looked like the reaction of a man who had just found out. I forced myself to set that thought aside. The DNA would have to wait. Caldwell Logistics couldn't. When I got home, I opened my offline laptop and connected the backup drive. I began reviewing roughly 6 months of records, covering the period when Diane's condition had worsened and I had spent most of my time at the hospital. There were dozens of small changes. Bradley's access privileges had been expanded, certain authentication procedures had been modified, several new vendor accounts had been created. Individually, none of them looked serious enough to trigger an alarm. Then I found a transaction. Several $100,000 had been transferred under the description of restructuring fees. I had never approved it. I opened the details. Then I found another transfer and another. I started adding them together. 1.2 million, 2.8 million, 3.7. Eventually, the number stopped at $4.5 million. Then I looked at the source account. I wished I had misread it. The money hadn't come from our ordinary operating funds. It had been taken directly from the employee pension fund. I sat motionless in front of the screen. Suddenly, this was no longer just a family struggle for control of a company. Someone was stealing the future from people who had spent their lives working for me. Part 4. $4.5 million. Spent the rest of the night tracing every transaction. The money had been divided into smaller amounts, each disguised under a different description, then routed to 4 companies registered in Delaware. Their names sounded perfectly ordinary: Strategic Freight Solutions, Northfield Advisory, Delaware Route Management, East Harbor Consulting. But Caldwell Logistics had never legitimately done business with any of them. I checked the vendor records. Every account had been created within the past few months. Everyone had been approved through the CFO's office, Bradley Jenkins. When I opened the transaction authentication records, my hands went cold. Every transfer carried my digital signature. I had never signed them. I had never even seen them. The first transfer had been made on the exact day I was sitting in the hospital with Diane while her doctor told us the cancer had spread and chemotherapy was no longer working. I remembered that day perfectly. Diane had been sitting in the hospital bed, holding my hand, asking whether we could go home. She didn't want to spend her final months surrounded by machines and the smell of antiseptic. While I sat beside my dying wife, someone at Caldwell Logistics had been using my signature to steal from the employee pension fund. I continued tracing the login history. The system addresses led back to administrative privileges controlled through Bradley's office. There were several layers in between, but the trail was clear enough for me to understand who had the authority to make those transfers happen. I pulled out the emergency transition agreement Monica had left behind and spread it across the table. The indemnification clause was no longer merely suspicious. It was the heart of the entire plan. If I signed, I would be acknowledging that I had reviewed and accepted responsibility for financial activity conducted before the transfer of control. When an audit eventually discovered that $4.5 million had disappeared, everything would point toward me. My digital signature was already attached to the transactions. My real signature would be on the agreement. I was 70 years old. My wife had just died. My family had repeatedly described me as emotionally unstable, exhausted, and in need of rest. They didn't just want my company. They wanted me to take the fall for them. Then I checked the date of the first suspicious transfer again. It had begun the same week. Diane received her terminal diagnosis. I had to walk away from the table. In 40 years of business, I had been deceived by partners. I had dealt with customers who broke contracts. I had lost money because of bad decisions. But nothing had ever disgusted me, as much as realizing that someone had looked at Diane's terminal illness and seen an opportunity. At 7 that morning, I called Victor Lang. Victor had been my attorney for more than 20 years. He had handled acquisitions, lawsuits, employment contracts, and even Diane's estate planning. I sent him the transition agreement, the transaction records, and the access logs. 2 hours later, we met at his office. Victor read through the documents in silence for nearly an hour. Finally, he removed his glasses. "Richard, don't sign anything. I wasn't planning to. And don't confront them." I asked why. Victor explained that if we wanted to prove this was organized fraud, we needed more than suspicious internal records. We needed to identify the real owners of the shell companies. We needed to trace where the money ultimately went. And we needed to establish exactly what role each person had played. Then he introduced me to Robert Sanchez. Robert was a former federal agent who had moved into private investigations. He was around 60, his hair almost completely gray, and he spoke like a man who considered unnecessary words a waste of oxygen. When we met, Robert asked what I wanted him to investigate. Everything about Monica and Bradley. He didn't ask why, he simply nodded. 3 days later, Robert called and said we needed to meet in person. He arrived at Victor's office, carrying a thick file. The first page contained an old photograph of Monica from college. Standing beside her was Bradley Jenkins. He was almost 30 years younger in the photograph, but there was no mistaking him. I looked at Robert. "What is this?" They used to be together. I felt my heartbeat slow. Bradley had joined Caldwell Logistics more than 20 years earlier. Monica had married Derek not long afterward. Robert spread more photographs across the table. A hotel, a restaurant 2 hours outside the city. A conference Bradley claimed he had attended alone. A trip during which Monica had told Derek she was traveling with friends. The dates stretched across years. How long has this been going on? Robert looked directly at me. There are signs it may never have actually stopped. I thought about Chase, 18 years old. Monica and Bradley had maintained some kind of relationship for almost 19 years. Before I could say what I was thinking, my phone vibrated. The laboratory. The DNA results were ready. I opened the email with hands that were no longer steady. The report was several pages long. I scrolled to the conclusion, probability of paternity, 0%. Derek was not Chase's biological father. I sat there without speaking. Robert read the report and asked whether I had a sample from Bradley or whether I wanted him to find a way to verify the possibility. I told him I only wanted the truth. Several days later, Robert legally obtained a discarded item containing Bradley's DNA and sent the sample to the same laboratory. The second result ended every remaining doubt. Bradley Jenkins was Chase's biological father. I stared at the near-certain probability on the report without knowing what I was supposed to feel. For the first few minutes, I felt sorry for Derek. I thought my son had spent almost 2 decades being betrayed by his wife. I thought perhaps all his weakness, avoidance, and strange behavior came from a wound he had been too ashamed to admit. I had no idea that I was about to discover Derek had never been the victim. Victor had his technicians restore old Caldwell Logistics email archives. If Monica and Bradley had used company systems over the years, there was a chance something still existed in the backups. We searched names, personal email addresses, old accounts, and deleted message threads. 2 days later, Victor called me into his office. He refused to explain over the phone. When I arrived, a stack of printed pages was already waiting on the table. "Richard, before you read this, I want you to prepare yourself." I hated sentences like that. Nothing good ever followed them. Victor explained that his technicians had recovered an email chain between Derek and Monica from about 10 years earlier. I picked up the first page. The opening lines were enough to stop me. Derek had written about a medical examination. His doctor had confirmed that he was infertile because of complications from a severe childhood infection. I kept reading. Derek knew Chase could not be his biological son. He hadn't just discovered it. He hadn't merely suspected it. He had known. Another email showed that Monica had admitted her relationship with Bradley. Derek hadn't divorced her. He hadn't confronted Bradley. He hadn't told me. He hadn't told Diane. Instead, he had agreed to continue pretending that Chase was biologically his. At first, his explanation sounded almost noble. Derek wrote that Diane would be devastated if she learned the truth. He said he didn't want Chase growing up in the middle of a family scandal. But the deeper I read, the clearer something else became: money, position. Inheritance. In one email, Derek wrote that if I discovered Chase wasn't a Caldwell by blood, I might change the family trust. In another, he worried that if Monica left him, I might begin questioning whether he was capable of leading the company. My son hadn't kept the secret only because he loved Chase. He had kept it because he was terrified of losing what he expected to inherit when I died. I lowered the papers. For a moment, all I could hear was the air conditioning inside Victor's office. I had always thought Derek was weak. I had always believed Monica controlled him. Both things were true. But weakness is not innocence. Derek had been given thousands of opportunities to tell the truth over almost 20 years. Every time, he had chosen silence. I thought about Diane. She had loved Chase more than almost anything. When Chase was 6 and developed pneumonia, Diane slept in a chair beside his bed for 3 nights, even though Monica told her she could go home. She bought him his first bicycle. She taught him to bake every Christmas. She kept every school photograph of him in a special box. Diane died without ever knowing the truth. Part of me was relieved that she had never been forced to endure that pain. Another part of me felt that Derek had stolen his own mother's right to know the truth. That night, I went home and sat in the living room in front of Diane's photograph. For the first time since the funeral, I spoke to her out loud. I didn't see it. I wasn't sure whether I meant Derek, Monica, or our entire family. Maybe I meant all of them. The next morning, I called Monica. I deliberately made my voice sound tired. I told her the past several days had made me realize that I no longer wanted to fight. I didn't want to spend the remaining years of my life trapped in board meetings and family conflict. Monica went silent for several seconds. Then her voice changed completely. Soft, warm, fake. "Richard, I knew you'd understand." I told her I would sign everything at the Friday morning board meeting. She asked whether I was sure. I said yes. "We're family." I almost laughed when she used that word. After the call, I looked at Victor. "She believes me." Victor nodded. We handed all the financial evidence to Special Agent Harrison, who was handling the early stages of the federal investigation. From that moment forward, the situation was no longer entirely under my control. If the evidence was strong enough, Monica and Bradley weren't simply going to lose the company. They were going to lose their freedom. Over the next several days, Monica became increasingly convinced that she had won. Thomas Sterling called me Wednesday evening. Thomas was our vice president of operations and had worked at Caldwell Logistics for more than 20 years. He told me Monica had informed him that he would be replaced once the transition was complete. 2 other managers had received similar notices. I asked whether Monica had given a reason. She said the company needs younger people. I told him not to do anything. Later, I learned Monica had even hired an interior designer to measure my office. She wanted to remove all the old wood furniture, paint the walls white, the desk, the photographs. Even the desk Diane had bought me the year Caldwell Logistics first turned a real profit was marked for removal. I didn't stop her. The closer Friday came, the more confident Monica became. That was exactly what I wanted. A trap only works when the person walking into it believes they're walking toward victory. Part 6. Friday morning he arrived at Caldwell Logistics At 8:40 on Friday morning, the board meeting was scheduled for 9. I sat in my car for several minutes before going inside. On the passenger seat was a leather briefcase containing copies of the DNA reports, Derek's emails, the transaction history, and Victor's legal documents. I looked at the building in front of me. Diane had come here every morning for decades. Her first office had been a tiny room beside the warehouse. When the company expanded, I once offered to move her upstairs to the executive floor. She refused. She said she preferred being close to the people who actually did the work. I wondered whether Monica had ever understood something like that. Probably not. When I entered the boardroom, Monica was already sitting at the head of the table. My chair. Derek sat on her right. Bradley sat on her left. The remaining board members were seated around the table, all of them visibly uncomfortable. In front of my seat sat the emergency transition agreement and a gold pen. Monica smiled. "Richard, I'm glad you came." I said nothing. I sat down. Monica began the meeting as if she were already CEO. She talked about a new era for Caldwell Logistics. She talked about family businesses needing to transition to the next generation. She talked about the need to move away from outdated methods. I looked at Thomas Sterling at the far end of the table. He said nothing. After nearly 10 minutes, Monica finally pushed the agreement toward me. "There's no reason to drag this out." I looked at the pen. Then I looked at Derek. My son avoided my eyes. I wanted to give him one last chance. "Derek, are you sure this is what you want?" Monica looked at him first. I noticed even now. Derek needed to see his wife's reaction before answering his father. He quietly said it was best for everyone. I asked whether he believed Diane would have agreed. The room fell silent. Monica sighed. "Stop making this emotional, Richard." I looked at her. Her patience was gone. "Now that the old woman is dead, you're finished here. Just sign it." Nobody moved. I looked at Derek. He remained silent. He didn't object to his wife calling his dead mother an old woman. He didn't demand an apology. He didn't even look at me. And in that moment, whatever remained inside me of a father still trying to save his son disappeared. I looked down at the pen. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3, then I pushed it away. "No." Monica stared at me as though she hadn't heard correctly. I said, "I'm not signing." She shot to her feet. "You agreed." I said I would come. "You said you would sign." I changed my mind. Her face transformed. For the first time, the polite mask disappeared completely. "You can't do this." I looked toward the door. "Actually, I can." The boardroom door opened. Victor Lang walked in. Behind him came Robert Sanchez, Special Agent Harrison, and 2 other federal agents. Bradley immediately stood. One of the agents moved in front of the door. Victor placed his briefcase on the table and removed a white envelope. "Before Mr. Caldwell signs anything, there are several matters the board needs to be made aware of." Monica looked at me. "What is this?" Victor placed the DNA report in front of her. "The test confirms that Derek Caldwell has a 0% probability of being Chase Caldwell's biological father." The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. Derek closed his eyes. Monica went pale. Bradley stopped looking at me. I looked around the table. "Would anyone like to explain?" Nobody answered. Victor placed the second report on the table. "The subsequent test confirms that Bradley Jenkins is Chase's biological father." Thomas Sterling drew in a sharp breath. Another board member turned toward Bradley. Monica stood frozen. Bradley began saying that personal matters had nothing to do with company business. I looked at him. 19 years of sleeping with my son's wife while serving as CFO of my company may not, by itself, be company business. Then I pointed at Victor's briefcase. "But the next part is..." Derek looked at me. "Dad, I can explain." I pulled out the emails. "No. First, I'm going to explain something to you." I placed the 10-year-old email chain in front of him. Derek looked at the first page. The color drained from his face. "I know you're infertile." He said nothing. "I know you knew Chase couldn't be your biological son." Derek began shaking his head. "Dad, it isn't what you think." "Then tell me which part I've misunderstood." He couldn't. I read enough of the emails aloud for the board. to understand that Derek had known the truth and deliberately hidden it because he feared losing his inheritance. Derek started crying. He said he loved Chase. I believed him, but love didn't erase 10 years of lies. I asked why he had never told Diane. Derek lowered his head. There was no answer good enough. Monica finally found her voice again. She said the DNA results were a private family matter and that I had no right to turn a board meeting into a trial of her personal life. I nodded. Fine. Then let's talk about money. Victor removed the financial records from his briefcase. He placed copies of the transactions in front of every board member. $4.5 million, 4 shell companies. My digital signature. The employee pension fund. Bradley looked down at the documents. I saw the exact moment he understood the game was over. I explained everything. During the months I had spent at the hospital with Diane, money had begun disappearing from the pen fund and moving into companies. Caldwell Logistics didn't actually use. The transactions had been authenticated with my digital signature, but the access records showed they had been initiated through administrative privileges tied to the CFO's office. Bradley spoke up. He said multiple people had administrative access. Victor replied that the FBI already had system logs, device addresses, and related banking records. Bradley fell silent. I looked at Monica. You want to know why I'm not signing? I picked up the emergency transition agreement because of this clause. I read the indemnification language. If I signed, I would be accepting responsibility for financial activity conducted before the transfer. When auditors eventually discovered the missing money, everything would look as though I had done it. A 70-year-old man, emotionally devastated, his wife dead, millions transferred under his digital signature. Then suddenly handing the company to the next generation, Monica shook her head. I didn't know anything about the money. Bradley turned toward her. Don't. Monica looked at him. This was your idea. The room went silent. Bradley gave a dry laugh. My idea? Who wanted Richard to sign? Who said we had to finish this before the quarterly audit? Monica's face twisted with anger. I didn't transfer the money, but you spent it. Special Agent Harrison didn't interrupt them. Maybe he understood that frightened people often revealed more when they thought they were saving themselves. Monica said Bradley had created the shell companies. Bradley said Monica had pushed him to take the money so they could prepare for life after Richard was removed from the company. I sat there watching two people who had protected the same secret for nearly 20 years turn on each other in less than 2 minutes. Then I looked at Derek. He remained silent. I didn't know how much he knew about the stolen money. There was no evidence that he had directly participated in the transfers. But he had stood beside Monica long enough to help put that agreement in front of me. That was enough. Special Agent Harrison walked toward Bradley. He informed him that he was under arrest in connection with wire fraud, embezzlement, and additional financial crimes still under investigation. Another agent moved toward Monica. She looked at me. Richard, don't do this. I said nothing. You can't let them arrest Chase's mother. I still said nothing. Panic spread across her face. We're family. There was that word again, family. I looked at the woman who had called Diane an old woman only minutes earlier, the woman who had slept with my CFO for nearly 2 decades, the woman who had tried to take my company and leave me responsible for $4.5 million stolen from my employees' retirement. No, I said. We were never family. The agents handcuffed Monica and Bradley. They continued blaming each other as they were escorted from the room. The door closed. The board members slowly began leaving. Thomas Sterling stopped beside me. He placed a hand on my shoulder, but didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Eventually, only Victor, Derek, and I remained. Derek was still sitting at the table. I looked at my son. I had imagined that watching Monica get arrested would feel like victory. It didn't. Watching Bradley get arrested didn't either. They made me angry, but Derek was the one who hurt me. He stood. Dad. I removed an envelope from my briefcase. Sit down. Derek looked at the envelope. Maybe he thought it contained more evidence. It didn't. It contained consequences. Part 8. My son lost everything. Derek opened the envelope. The first page was a notice terminating his employment at Caldwell Logistics, effective immediately. The second was a notice requiring him to vacate the house Diane and I had purchased for his family almost 15 years earlier. Derek looked at me as though he didn't understand. You're firing me? From the company? Yes. This place belongs to me too. No. My voice remained calm. You always assumed it would belong to you one day. That isn't the same thing. Derek picked up the notice regarding the house. You can't take our house. Victor explained that the property was still owned by my trust. Derek and Monica had only been granted conditional use of it. I told Derek he had a deadline to move out. He began to panic. Chase was still recovering. Monica had just been arrested. His family was falling apart. I reminded him that 3 days after burying his mother, he had sat in my kitchen and helped pressure me into signing a document we now knew had been designed to shift financial liability onto me. I didn't know about the $4.5 million. Maybe. I swear. I didn't say you transferred the money. Derek stared at me. Then why are you doing this? I placed the email chain in front of him. Because of this, I told him Monica might have controlled him. Monica might have lied to him. Monica might have betrayed him. But Monica hadn't written those emails with Derek's hands. She hadn't forced him to hide his infertility from Diane. She hadn't forced him to build 10 years of lies around his inheritance. And she hadn't forced him to remain silent when his wife insulted his dead mother. Derek began crying. He told me he had been afraid. Afraid Monica would leave. Afraid he would lose Chase. Afraid I would look at him as a failure. I listened to everything. Maybe if he had told me those things 10 years earlier, I would have put my arms around my son and tried to help him. But those words were coming after thousands of choices to keep lying. I told him Victor had already revised my estate plan. Derek would receive no shares in Caldwell Logistics, no personal assets, no control over the trust. He stared at me in disbelief. I'm your only son. Yes. Then who are you leaving everything to? I haven't told you yet. Derek asked whether I was truly going to disinherit my own son's son. I told him he had never been entitled to my property, simply because he had been born my son. Diane and I had spent our lives creating those assets. We had the right to decide where they went. Derek had nothing left to say. Chase was much harder. He hadn't chosen his biological father. He hadn't chosen the lie. And he hadn't participated in stealing from the pension fund. Once Chase was healthy enough, I went to see him. We sat outside Derek's house. Chase was still using crutches. I told him there was something he needed to know. I didn't tell him every detail of Monica's crimes. Simply told him the truth about his biological father. Chase stared at me for a long time. He asked whether I was certain. I handed him the report. He read several lines and then stopped. He began to cry. He asked whether Derek had known. I didn't lie. Yes. Chase closed his eyes. I could almost see 18 years of childhood being rewritten inside his head. Then he asked the question that hurt me most. Does that mean you're not my grandfather anymore? I didn't answer immediately. DNA said no. 18 years said something else. I told Chase that the days I had held him as a baby, taken him fishing, or watched Diane bake with him didn't disappear because of a laboratory report. But I also told him life was going to change. I would pay his tuition and living expenses for exactly 1 year. After that, he would have to stand on his own. There would be no executive position waiting for him at Caldwell Logistics. No luxury car. No endless account Monica had raised him to believe would always be there. If he wanted to become a man, he would have to build his own life. Chase asked whether I hated him. I don't hate you. But I'm not a Caldwell. I looked at him. Maybe it's time you learned that your last name doesn't decide what kind of man you become. Then I stood and left. For the first time since everything had begun, I felt that I was no longer simply tearing down lies. I was rebuilding boundaries I should have established years earlier. Part 9. Diane Legash. 6 months later, the main phase of the criminal case came to an end. Monica and Bradley were each sentenced to 15 years in prison for their roles in wire fraud and embezzlement. The shell companies were shut down, related assets were frozen. Whatever money could be recovered was returned. When I heard the sentence, I didn't feel happy. There had been a time when I thought watching Monica lose everything would satisfy me. Reality was different. 15 years in prison didn't bring Diane back. It didn't erase nearly 20 years of lies. It simply ensured that the people responsible would have to live with the consequences of what they had done. Derek moved into a small apartment on the other side of town. No more office at Caldwell Logistics. No more large house, no company card, no expensive dinners where he never had to look at the bill. The last I heard, he was working a retail job for close to minimum wage. A friend once asked whether that made me happy. I told him no. A father doesn't spend 46 years raising a son and then feel joy watching him fail. But there is a difference between loving someone and continuing to protect them from consequences. I had confused those two things for far too long. Caldwell Logistics needed to be repaired. The first person I called was Thomas Sterling. I asked him to come back. Then I contacted the managers Monica had pushed out. Some of them hesitated. I didn't blame them. They had watched the founder's own family nearly seize control of the company. I met with each of them and made it clear that it was over. Then I called an all-company meeting. No press, no cameras, just employees. I stood in front of people who had spent 10, 20, even 30 years at Caldwell Logistics and told them what had happened to their pension fund. I hid nothing. $4.5 million had been taken. I told them every dollar would be restored. Some of the money was recovered from frozen assets. I covered the rest, personally. Victor had asked whether I wanted to wait until the legal process ended to see how much could be recovered. I said no. Those people shouldn't have to wait because of what my family had done. Within weeks, the pension fund was fully restored. One of our drivers, a man named Frank, came to see me in my office. He had worked for Caldwell Logistics for 27 years. Frank told me that he and his wife planned to retire in 3 years. The money in that fund was what they expected to use for their mortgage, medication, and basic living expenses. He thanked me. I felt uncomfortable hearing it. I only gave back what already belonged to you. Frank looked at me. Not everybody would have done that. Those words stayed with me for a long time. After everything that had happened, I had to decide what would happen to Caldwell Logistics when I was gone. For most of my life, the answer had been simple: Derek, then Chase, family. But the word family meant something different to me now. I called Victor to my house. We sat in the same kitchen where Monica had once placed the emergency transition agreement in front of me. This time, the document on the table was a new trust, an irrevocable one. I decided that 50% of my estate would go to the Diane Caldwell Scholarship Fund. The fund would provide scholarships to young people from families with limited means who were willing to study, work, and fight for the chance to change their lives. Diane would have loved that. She had never cared what last name someone carried. She cared about what people did with the opportunities they were given. The remaining 50% would go into an employee ownership program for Caldwell Logistics, the drivers, the warehouse workers, the dispatchers, the managers, the people who had actually helped build the company. Victor asked whether I was certain. I told him I had never been more certain about anything. I didn't want another child in the Caldwell family growing up believing that carrying the right last name entitled them to a life they had never earned. If Caldwell Logistics survived after I was gone, it should belong to the people who worked to keep it alive. Several weeks later, I announced the decision to the employees. I didn't tell them every detail of what had happened inside my family. They already knew enough. I simply told them that for most of my life, I had believed legacy meant building something and then handing it to your children. I had been wrong. Legacy isn't making sure the person who carries your last name owns everything after you die. Legacy is making sure what you built continues serving the values that made you build it in the first place. When I finished speaking, nobody applauded immediately. Then Thomas stood, others followed. I don't know whether Diane believed in things like spirits standing somewhere and watching over us. She used to joke that if there was an afterlife, she hoped the dead had better things to do than watch the living make mistakes. But that day, I wanted to believe she was somewhere out there and understood. That evening, I went home. The house was still quiet. The difference was that the silence no longer frightened me. I walked into the kitchen. Diane's blue mug was still sitting on the shelf. I hadn't used it once in 6 months. I took it down, washed it, placed it beside my own coffee cup. Then I sat at the table and looked at the empty chair across from me. I thought about 1985. The rusted truck, $100. Two people who had no idea how they were going to survive the next month, but trusted each other enough to keep going. Deanne hadn't stayed with me because of money. When we met, there was no money. She hadn't stayed because of Caldwell Logistics. When she chose me, Caldwell Logistics didn't even exist. She stayed when the truck broke down, when our bank account was nearly empty, when we had no idea how we were going to make payroll, and when the company finally became successful. Diane was still the same woman who had once sat beside me counting every gallon of fuel. That was what Derek, Monica, and Bradley had never understood. They looked at the company and saw money. Deanne looked at the company and saw the years we had survived together. Monica had believed Diane's death made me weak. For the first few days, maybe she was right. I didn't sleep. I barely ate. I didn't want to walk into the office. But she had misunderstood one thing. Grief didn't erase what Diane had taught me over nearly half a century. Bradley thought changing a password could lock me out of something I had built. Derek thought a father's love meant I would never allow him to suffer the consequences of his choices. All three of them misunderstood the same thing. They thought loyalty to family meant blindness. It doesn't. Deanne taught me that loyalty has to move in both directions. When we had only $100, she stood beside me. When I failed, she stood beside me. When I succeeded, she didn't change. That was family. I used to believe blood made a family. At 70 years old, I finally understood that blood only creates a relationship. A marriage certificate only creates a relationship. A last name only creates a relationship. What turns a relationship into a family is how people treat you when they have the opportunity to betray you. Diane had thousands of opportunities to leave when life became difficult. She never did. Derek had thousands of opportunities to tell the truth. He never did. That was the difference. I looked at Diane's blue mug on the table and, for the first time since she died, I smiled when I thought about her. Not because the pain was gone. I don't think that kind of pain ever disappears completely. But I finally understood how to protect what Diane and I had built, not by keeping it inside the Caldwell bloodline at any cost, but by placing it in the hands of people who deserved it, the employees who had stood by the company, the young people who would receive Diane's scholarships and be given opportunities we never had, people who understood that $100 could become $15 million if you worked